We're in the middle of a political realignment across the Western world. The problems with healthcare are too much bureaucracy, too much red tape, and terrible, terrible, terrible incentives. Trump has no vision or plan for you, doesn't care about you. He's a malignant narcissist, very self-absorbed, in cognitive decline.
You are one of the few in the liberty movement who is endorsing Kamala Harris for president. A lot of people are going to hear that, and they're going to roll their eyes at it. Harris played a sizable role in 1,500 people imprisonment for marijuana offenses, and laughed off the question when she was asked about her own marijuana usage. Do you see a contradiction between calling for liberty, but also calling for taxpayers to fund foreign conflicts?
NATO expansion, I don't buy the narrative. I also say liberalism always wins in the end because the sheer power of giving people freedom in their own lives, it will always beat authoritarianism.
My guest for this installment is Joshua Reed Eakle. He's a classical liberal known for his involvement with the organization Project Liberal, as well as for his polarizing place within the liberty movement. Although Josh and I certainly disagree in some crucial areas, we sought to find common ground between his belief in liberal democracy and my own adherence to market anarchism. This is episode 24 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which Eakle and I discuss the 2024 presidential election, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Project Liberal's mission, among other subjects. Hello, Joshua Reed Eakle. Thanks for your appearance. And where should my listeners go if they're interested in seeing more of your work?
You can follow me on Twitter at Josh Eakle. You can also check out, my website has links to all my socials at joshuaeakle.com. And Evan, you pronounce my last name right. Everyone pronounces it wrong. So we're already off to an amazing start. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I know it's not Eakle, and it's certainly not Urkel.
Yeah, exactly. Not either one of those.
Right, yep. So jumping right in, so you are a co-founder of Project Liberal, and this is an institution that seeks to establish a society that's a bit more in line with the classical liberal values. And on that note, I have found that this organization seems to go out of its way to use the word liberal and not to use it interchangeably with the word libertarian, as some people tend to do.
Yeah.
So in order to avoid something of a semantic issue down the line, I do think we should start by defining what liberalism actually is. After all, the fact that we have terms such as classical liberalism and neoliberalism does tend to indicate that there are some clashing approaches to this concept. Liberal has become a pretty politically charged word in our society. A lot of people have come to associate this word with people who are simply Democrats. And this is simultaneously a philosophy, after all, that Ludwig von Mises wrote pretty extensively about and in favor of.
Yep.
And to be clear, he did point out also that this word in the United States now means something completely contrary to what it meant back in the 19th century. So anyway, just putting long story short, what I wanted to ask you is, what does it mean to be a liberal? That is, what is classical liberalism? And how do you believe that liberalism as a philosophy has been distorted over the years?
It's a great question. So at the center of liberalism, I think, is the idea of an expansion of human freedom. So, at our leadership team and myself believes that really every great thing that has happened in society, and at least in the human story, is when you see an expansion of human freedom. So when I look at the right, I look at them, at least the legacy right, before they kind of turned into whatever they are now. They understood maybe this economic argument, right? The idea that the freer the market, more prosperity, freer people. On the left, they understand a bit more about the concept of maybe individual freedom, social liberties, right? Like the idea that you should be free to do what you want with your own body, free to move, et cetera, et cetera. And then, there's political freedom, which seems both sides, based on any given time, may have a different definition on what that might look like in application. But I look at it through those three main axes. And I think liberalism at large is a philosophy that embraces freedom, hard stop, across those three axes. And I personally consider myself a classical liberal, but I think classical liberals are in the liberalism bucket alongside many other people that may have a little bit more, say, less economic say less of the hard lines on economic stuff that maybe people like you and I who have strong admiration for people like Ludwig von Mises would have. I think liberalism at large is this idea directionally we need to move towards a more freer world, and there's a variety of ways to do that. But that's kind of the high level way I would look at the philosophy and explain it.
Okay, excellent. So, kind of having addressed liberalism, I think it would make sense to look at the other side of the coin, the libertarian etymology, you could say, the semantics behind that. So I personally have no qualms, whatsoever about calling myself a libertarian.
Yeah.
In fact, I would cite, Murray Rothbard's work For a New Liberty as a book that really lays out the foundation for the libertarian tradition. This is a book that pretty explicitly presents libertarianism, in his view, not as a particular subcategory of liberalism or conservatism for that matter, but as its own branch of thought. And I find this interesting considering that liberals and conservatives and pretty much everybody on the entire political spectrum does present themselves as pro-liberty, but even though that is certainly some cases, objectively not the case, I do know that the case that Rothbard makes on the difference between liberalism and libertarianism, I know essentially how that goes, but I am curious to hear your perspective on this matter in your own words. So basically, what is the difference between a classical liberal and a libertarian, and why is it you prefer to refer to yourself as a liberal rather than a libertarian?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I don't actually think there's a difference in many cases, based on my definition of what libertarianism is, between like classical liberalism and libertarianism. I think that there are people on the fringes of libertarian thought that are trying to redefine that word, but I'll speak to it a little bit more from my background and my personal kind of the way that I do this. I'm a communications, a marketing executive. I'm a political organizer. So I look at it in the vein of that kind of an approach. So the reason I use liberal now is I've been very deeply inspired by David Vos, right, the former EVP of Cato. In the last several years of his life, I was able to strike up a relationship with him and speak to him about this. And he said something in his last speech that libertarianism is effectively the core of liberalism. The ideas of libertarianism is if you take liberal philosophy and apply it radically to the world, right? I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So I look at libertarians in that traditional definition as people that truly believe these values and are radical in their application of it. The reason, now this goes back to the reason I mentioned the distinction about being a political organizer. The reason I don't use the word libertarian is because I don't believe it means that anymore. I think that it's selectively applied, especially in the minds of the electorate. I think the word libertarian doesn't mean radical expansion of human freedom. I mean, many of the major political leaders and thought leaders that I'm seeing in the libertarian movement nowadays are embracing things like, closing the border and putting the military on the border. They're making arguments for isolationism and a rejection of free trade. They're spreading misinformation and fear about LGBTQ people. And so in the minds of the electorate, looking at this purely strategically, I don't think using the libertarian label is advantageous for the furtherance of this radical liberal philosophy, right? Because I think in the minds of most of the public, it's kind of corrupted. So the way I look at it is, we're in the middle of a political realignment across the Western world. Steve Davies from IEA London spoke about this. I've referenced his work many times because he's been a big inspiration for the way that I look at this play out. You and I grew up in this post-Reagan political environment, and the environment that kind of came out, it was kind of an outcropping of fusionism. The three-legged stool of the Reagan coalition was this kind of conservative libertarian alliance against the left. That's been the dominant kind of political coalition that brought us through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right up until today. That framework is completely falling apart. Like not only in the United States, but this kind of alliance is completely fracturing. I think you, Evan, and I have a similar background in libertarian, as you mentioned in your show. I know you do a lot of work in the libertarian space. I don't know how involved you were in the party, but with the advent of Trumpism, I actually looked at liberalism, this kind of universalist, tolerant philosophy, as effectively the fracture point that kind of broke apart these old coalitions within the libertarian movement. And that was a microcosm of what was happening in the broader political space. This is the reason why you see more tolerant, traditional conservatives breaking with Trump, because the underlying division, I think, between Trumpism, populist authoritarianism, and this new coalition really comes down to concepts. And this is what Steve Davies talks about. It really comes down to an embrace of either you embrace openness, right? This idea of being open to the world or being closed off to it. You embrace dynamism, right? And innovation over, say, closeness or protectionism, right? This kind of idea that we need to kind of protect what we have and protect our own. It also comes down to the idea of whether you embrace this idea of having a chosen identity or whether you believe people should have a prescribed identity. And actually, I think this comes down to a lot of the stuff that I hear from Hoppians, like this idea that there's this established natural order and there are people that have, say, higher status versus lower status. And those people are they have this prescribed status in society versus this idea that you can embrace your own identity, build your own path, make your own future. And there's obviously geographic things at play, but really to put a bow on this, I see those three things: this embrace of chosen identity versus prescribed identity, openness versus closeness, dynamism and innovation versus stability and order, as the three major dividing lines between the coalition that is being formed right now that's going to take us through the next 50 years. This is straight from Steve Davies' work. So you could go look at what Steve Davies talks about. This is straight from his one of his talks and some of his writing. And so I look at that and I say, what we're basically, the framework we're going into as a civilization, as you know, the Western world is going into effectively a cosmopolitan liberal alliance versus a populist kind of authoritarian alliance. And so it's not a conservative libertarian versus, say, these economic authoritarians like what we grew up with. It's a completely different framework. And so in the context of these shifting coalitions, I'm trying to look to the future. I'm trying to look at where things are headed. And I think that we're primed primed to really bring back liberalism to its old, before it was corrupted in the, say, 20th century, right? This kind of bastardization of whatever it was, bring back its true definition, recontextualize it for modern times, apply it for modern times, and build a coalition that can transcend party lines, unlike what we've seen, because we're in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime political realignment opportunity. So that's the reason why I embrace the label. That's less of an academic answer, I know, and it's more of kind of a strategic positioning answer, but there is a dense intellectual tradition to liberalism. I mean, we know this. I mean, this is the foundation of Western civilization. It's the Enlightenment, right? So we have an amazing resource to pull from. And on top of that, because there's this political realignment playing out, there are the people that really hate liberal values, like the far left, like the extreme far left, like the tankies and some of these kind of economic authoritarians and the progressives in the progressive group. They hate that word. They're using leftist. They're not using liberal anymore. That's a word they're not using. And the word really pisses off the far right. Like, it's a word that you're never going to see a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist try to embrace. And so I look at it as a good foundation for us to build a new movement on. And that's kind of really the reason why I'm pursuing this. I don't know if that answers your question, but that gave you a long-winded answer. That's where I'm at in my head.
There is certainly something to be said of the people on the right who have come to see figures such as Reagan and Thatcher as the symbols of the liberty movement, where I think that that's very misguided and erroneous when you actually look at their policies and you see that what they are doing is, if anything, very much stifling individual liberty. Yes, in that sense. But
yeah, there were many things that Thatcher and Reagan did that were not liberal at large, right? But the one thing that I will say, though, to Reagan's credit, is he did have a broad embrace of kind of these core liberal ideas, right? I mean, I'd say there's no one that did more to popularize, I think, in the modern world, like this idea of free trade, openness, international cooperation, this embrace of immigration, this embrace of kind of a pluralist society than Reagan really did. There's a lot of things he did wrong. We could talk about the AIDS crisis and the handling of that. We could talk about gun control. We could talk about a variety of different things, scandals after scandals. But so I think he does get some points for that. And actually, I think he's kind of on a rehabilitation tour right now. And it's mainly due to the fact that the Republican Party has really rejected many of the foundational tenets of what Reaganism was. That's making people kind of return back to that and go, well, I mean, it would be great if we at least had a Republican Party that kind of embraced these basic principles of pluralism and openness and, you know what I mean? These kind of things. But yeah, I digress.
Right, yes. So I do think we've kind of set a good foundation on, the liberal tradition here. And having established this context, I did want to move on to your work with Project Liberal. And I do understand that it's easy for political organizations to say, in some cases, that they stand for certain empty platitudes, such as happiness or love or what's best for everybody. But in this case, I am curious about the specifics. So this is to say, what type of society does Project Liberal want to bring about, and what strategies does this group take when it tries to bring about this particular society? What types of politicians does it generally align itself with? Or just in short, what is Project Liberal and what are its exact goals?
So I'll talk about, I guess, the society stuff. I mean, this would be so we talked about the political realignment, the shifting coalitions, the values of that realignment. At the center of the idea of what we want to do is we want to see a society. So actually, let me zoom out a little bit. I came out of the libertarian organizing space. That's what I did for over a decade. I worked for Congressman Amash when he ran for president 2020. I was a state chair. I was a libertarian organizer. The really big problem that people, that libertarians have, and that the radical liberals, as I would call them, those of which that are aligned with this philosophy, is they have a very hard time taking away the dogma and looking at how to build coalitions across the aisle and finding common ground with people, because they have very strict, very solid and kind of dogmatic views, right? So at the center of this, we'll talk about tactics, right? Because that's a tactical conversation. There's a tactical element, but I'll put that aside for a second, come back to it. We do want to see a society that embraces economic, political, and individual freedom. Hard stop. So what that means is we're willing to partner with people that want to move directionally into an economy that has more choice, where people have more latitude and freedom to make a better future for themselves, where people are freer in their lives, free in speech, free in how they associate, free in the decisions they make with their own bodies. And we want to see a world where people are politically free, where they don't have barriers to being represented, where they get to engage in the democratic process and have their voice heard, where they're not stifled or they're not taken advantage of by strongmen or oppressive systems, right? So the idea is we want to embrace it at all fronts. That seems maybe a bit of a kind of a high level, everyone be happy mindset, but truthfully, liberal philosophy has been the background noise of American politics for a very long time. That's basically been the background noise of our politics since we were founded. We don't believe that it's the background noise anymore. We look at what's happening on the far right, we look at what's happening on the extreme left, and we say that this embrace of liberalism as a philosophy, these kind of basic principles, are no longer common sense. And so it's time for us to create a coalition that embraces them, that reminds people what they mean, that contextualizes them, and then, to the point of tactics, build a cross-partisan coalition of voters, of candidates, of intellectuals, doesn't matter their partisan background, that are willing to embrace these very large directional goals. It's different tactically than the libertarian approach, which is very, for better or worse, very purist. It's also strategically requires us to talk about the most important elements of our coalition, the most important values that we have, rather than say get into the weeds on this issue or that issue to try to say create conflict. At the center of it, though, what we want to see is an attractive and ascendant liberal identity that's juxtaposed against the authoritarianism and the kind of fascism of the far right and the authoritarian communism of the far left. And we want to have that identity transcendent and visible and online and going to intellectual combat with these voices to further those values. And then again, we also want to build this ecosystem. We want to see a coalition of young people, both voters and intellectuals and politicians, that are driving this. You had some more to your question that I'm happy to dig into, but that's tactically the vision, right? Is this broad-based coalition around liberal values and a liberal identity that is not only reflective of its core intellectual tradition, but also is prominent digitally and in person and is engaged in ideological combat and not kind of on the fringes or in the background.
I'm sure you are aware that, in terms of public opinion, there are some people, let's say on the internet or through social media, who have given you some level of pushback, for example.
You could say that.
And in that case, I'm wondering, in that vein, I'm curious what the biggest obstacle you have faced in achieving this institution's goals. Since I'm also wondering if, I know that other figures in your organization have also faced similar pushback, such as Joe Walsh.
Yeah, we have a very diverse coalition, right? So that's the key. Is like I've got former liberal conservatives and Democratic Party operatives and former libertarians and politically homeless. I mean, there's a variety of different people that are all coming from different backgrounds. And that's honestly indicative to me of a success of our strategy, because we see there's a political realignment happening. So we know that the people that are our allies are going to be in multiple and diverse camps, right? So we don't expect them all to be like Democrats or Republicans. We want them to be diverse because we know that they're caught between these legacy systems that no longer represent the coalitions that they actually embrace. So, I don't know. I mean, actually, the way that I try to handle this, Evan, whenever I go into, whenever I deal with conflict online or people kind of hating on me or whatever, is I look to the voices that I respect. And if those people are giving me bad signal, then I know that that's a problem. If I got like 1,000 Twitter bots or whatever screaming at me, I'm not, I don't really lose sleep over that. And not to say every one of my replies are Twitter bots, but there's definitely a bunch of them. And there's also a bunch of anon accounts that always, kind of come after me all the time. So that's the way that I handle it. It has been, I'm trying to think like barriers. Like barriers for us is we're operating outside of the political framework that exists. So that can be more difficult for us to say grow the institutional type support that we need. And what I mean by that is if I'm going to like somebody in the Democratic Party and I'm like, I'm going to help you elect Democrats, then it's easy for me to get money or say major institutional support from you. But if I go to you and I say, I want to support liberalism at large, what that might mean is embracing, say, liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats, then that is more difficult for us from a scaling perspective. That's probably been the first thing that I would throw up that's been maybe more difficult, but that's the nature of the mission that we're on. I know that that's going to be a challenge. But I also think that, and I'll say one more thing to this, another thing that's been challenging is everyone has pet issues that they're very passionate about. I'm very, it's funny because a lot of people might not believe this based on this, my online internet. I'm very passionate about the Second Amendment, right? I carry firearms. I have a concealed carry permit. I shoot. I live in Tennessee, for God's sakes. We have many people in our coalition passionate about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, like the idea of just a complete universal approach to everyone should have fire, no change. That is a divisive topic within this coalition. I can meet many people that believe directionally in political freedom and even individual freedom, and they might say, "I want to say have universal background checks," and that might be where I make my make my fight on the Second Amendment. There's issues like that where maybe there's some contention between the Democrats and the Republicans in the coalition. Abortion's another one of those. The way that we approach those conversations is we say, you can have your own passionate opinion. As a goal, our organization is focused on the broad defense of the liberal tradition, and we know directionally people are going to have disagreements on the fringes of how those conversations play out. That's been the hardest thing, is putting together a messaging strategy that can unite all these different people and keep them in the same coalition. And as you know, every topic is divisive in politics, so choosing those is very difficult. It's kind of like it's a very difficult game to play.
Yes. Yes. On the topic of, how divisive each, particular topic can be, when I look at the overall platform of Project Liberal and I look at the platforms of other liberty organizations, we can talk about FEE or the Mises Institute, that also have their own platforms that they try to reach out for. Where would you say exactly that Project Liberal differs from them? What would you say makes it unique compared to other libertarian organizations?
So we are going to come out with a manifesto in the next 60 or so days. We're launching our nonprofit arm, and we're about to make a very big announcement. We're going to release a full-blown manifesto with a clear set of priorities. Right now we have maxims, right? I'm sure you've seen our website. We've got these kind of broad-based statements of what we want to see. So politically, there's an overlap between like FEE and us, or organizations like where I used to work with Students for Liberty. There's a lot of overlap. There's even overlap with us between, say, moderate Democratic Party organizations that want to see the Democratic Party embrace YIMBYism and supply side solutions, to like a housing crisis or to healthcare, things like that. there's alignment between us and traditional conservatives because they want to see, the rule of law, and they want to see, like very basic, these very basic things. They want to see, they have a strong embrace of truth and things like that. So there's overlap in many different places. That's kind of the idea. Is if you're looking at a Venn diagram, we want to be in the center of all these different liberal groups. But to be clear, the manifesto will release in 60 days. We've been waiting for that because we want to get it right. So we definitely want to bring that back. Structurally, the way that we're operating that's different is, we are launching a C3 and a C4 that's going to focus on education and grassroots building. But really, the idea here is, I look at us at the beginning of the building of a new grassroots movement. And I think a lot of other organizations, especially organizations like the ones you mentioned, have been around for a long time, and they're operating in the framework of the old political coalitions. They're operating in that framework, and they're also operating with the messaging strategy of these old coalitions. And so for us, we want to look at ourselves at the top of the funnel for people that are kind of interested in liberal philosophy. We want to give them very easy to digest, educational pieces, give them an identity that they can latch onto, and then basically serve as the very top of the funnel for this new grassroots movement and drive those people into organizations that are aligned with us, that we believe are furthering our values. So structurally, that's a little bit different because, I don't know, like any of these libertarian organizations are focused a lot more on maybe education within a niche. We're focused on building a broader based political movement, bringing people into a coalition, and then starting something that will hopefully form into a powerful political bloc in the next decade or so.
Okay. Yes. So, in that case, do you see that there's any real issue substantially in terms of the actual philosophy? Do you see any issue with FEE or the Mises Institute in terms of the approach they take towards liberty? Do you think they hold any erroneous beliefs, or that they don't emphasize certain issues enough?
Well, I could go say I don't want to spend the podcast attacking different works, to be honest with you. I definitely think that the Mises Institute embraces a lot of liberal values. Like their Hoppian adjacent stuff, which we may get into later. But I think that even like the one thing I'll give the Mises Institute credit for is that whenever I look up to get a copy of Mises's work, they've got it there for free. So they're at least doing something, because the work of Ludwig von Mises, I can't talk, is obviously incredibly important work, and that needs to be distributed to as many people as possible. So I can at least give them credit for that. But yeah, I would say there's probably differences of opinion within these different groups, but I don't feel the need to maybe go after them. I would rather look at the things where we would agree. And I think, like, for example, with FEE, there's a lot of things that we agree on. We have a broad-based embrace of economic freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of association, right? Like, these things are very, very important. So I'd see them as kind of fellow travelers, so to speak, in the journey, alongside many of these other libertarian organizations that are doing that kind of important work.
I can understand, how you might not feel comfortable, speaking ill of certain organizations. But I, on the other hand, have no problem doing that. So while we're talking about these liberty-minded groups, I do want to draw some attention to a recent controversy involving Students for Liberty. I do know this is a group that you used to work with, but no longer do. But recently, they did fire several people, I believe last month or so, through some apparently very underhanded means. So just to give you some backstory here, one of these people who were fired is a good friend of mine, and she was explaining to me that, she essentially woke up one morning to find an email from Students for Liberty where they pretty impersonally told her that she was fired without providing any real concrete reason behind it. And anyway, from there she went on to tweet about it, essentially brought the case to social media. That brought some ire against them. And what I find amusing about that is that after she did this, Students for Liberty then told her that if she had been a team player, she wouldn't have revealed this publicly in the first place. And I can't help but think that if they were team players, they would have been able to actually explain why they were firing her and to be open about why they're suddenly casting all of these people out of their organization. Now, this same woman was telling me that they're apparently, I can't necessarily state this for a fact, I'm just simply repeating what she had told me, that they're trying to essentially shift their philosophy towards more of almost a neocon perspective. And she was telling me that, there were also some ugly reasons for this, such as certain donors had issues with her. For example, she was an objectivist.
Okay.
Certain people in the organization did adhere to an objectivist philosophy. And anyway, from here, where I want to get into really the juicy stuff here, is that, certain people in the organization had made claims, and this had caused some controversy within Students for Liberty. For example, Ross Ulbricht, for one of the people. One of the people in charge was essentially making a claim that Ross Ulbricht was engaging in child pornography, that he was consuming it, basically moving it himself through Silk Road, for example. And she was essentially challenging this, saying, where is the evidence of this? This person was telling her that, oh, it's in the court documents, it's there. She went through the court documents, searched the whole thing. They were pulling up the, searching through it, Command F, child pornography, all of these different keywords, no reference to it. And then this person was essentially, basically just becoming increasingly angry with her and insisting that it was there, despite not being able to provide the actual concrete evidence. And she believes that this also played a role in her dismissal. But while we're talking about Ross Ulbricht, I am kind of curious, though, what your stance is on him. Would you agree that he should be set free from prison, or what is your stance on that?
That's a great question. So to comment on the Students for Liberty thing, as I mentioned to you, I have actually went full-time on Project Liberal last month, right when all that stuff started happening. So I can't speak to any of that internal drama there that might have caused that. It actually happened, I think it was the week that I left, so when all that stuff had come out. And that's also wouldn't have even been in my peer review because I was in communications and marketing where that would have been more of a programs thing. So I'm not exactly sure what happened there. But to the point about Ross, no, I think that Ross's sentence was absolutely disproportionate and extreme. I do believe that when we have a situation, the same thing could be said with like Edward Snowden, for example. Edward Snowden did break the law, right? And he did, in fact, engage in criminal activity. There's a conversation to be had about like a proportionate sentence for him, right? Should Ross have been served multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole for building a website where, again, we all know there was absolutely abhorrent things that happened on that website. People were killed. You talked about the child abuse situation. There was absolute fraud. There were really bad things that happened because that website was created. But at the same time, Ross I don't have all the nuance of every bit about the court cases and all that. At the same time, Ross basically built a platform for people to engage in free exchange. There were many things that happened on that website that were very bad. There were things that happened on that website that were not morally abhorrent, right? It was basically an exchange for people to engage in commerce without some sort of external force kind of manipulating. With that freedom comes problems. So I think that Ross should have probably served some time for that because he did break laws. But at the same time, the sentence that was given to him was absolutely disproportionate, and there are people that have done far worse things that have served far less insane sentences. So I think, yes, at this time, it's a stain on our criminal justice system, the way that he was treated, because he was kind of made an example of in order to kind of keep other people from doing this. And I think that was completely unfair for him. I mean, there are people that have murdered multiple people and have gotten off with lesser sentences. And Ross really just built a website, right? Like the people that should be the people that have that are the most morally reprehensible in that case are the people that are engaging in the criminal activity, not the guy that built a website. It's almost like saying, because Elon Musk owns Twitter, he's now morally responsible for every illicit thing that happens behind the scenes on that platform. It's just not the same. It's not the same equivalent, right? He should not have had such an insane sentence. So that would be my answer about Ross. I think that he's served, how many years has he served now? He's been, 15?
It's been over a decade, yes.
Yeah, it's been about 15 years. And it is a tragedy. I met Ross's mother. We've had her at conferences before. I agree with her mission, telling people about the state, really how he was made an example of. And I really hope that some president comes in the future, or someone with a latitude to kind of commute that sentence. I think that would be well received. I don't see a reason why he should basically rot in prison for the rest of his life at this point.
Right, yes. The philosophical crux of this issue is really the debate between, how responsible should he be if he simply founded the website? He's not the one who's necessarily,
Exactly.
putting this harmful material through.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's exactly the center of it is, I mean, if we're going to hold Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, or all these people responsible for everything that happens on their platforms, it's definitely, you're going to have some serious issues. There is something to be said about terms of service. There is something to be said about making sure your platform isn't a mechanism for abuse. And I know many people in Ross's, the people that are more familiar with the nuances of the case, which I'm not deeply familiar with the nuances of the case, may make some arguments that he tried to do those things. I've heard both sides of that debate. But at the same time, like killing someone and a murder for hire agreement, let's say it was on Silk Road, is more morally reprehensible than somebody who created a website. It's just more morally reprehensible, right? So the fact that people can engage in murder and they can get off with lesser sentences than him, that seems to me to be a moral failure. And so that's really all I could say about it. I don't think that he should have been necessarily set free from day one. I think he did break the law, but I don't think that whatever sentence he received was proportionate for the crime. Especially looking at some of these sentences for people that did engage in very significant illegal activity on his platform that got off with lesser sentences, right? So that doesn't make sense to me.
Right, exactly. And what you were touching on there, if we apply that principle consistently across the line, then there's no doubt that Mark Zuckerberg would certainly belong in prison if we apply that same reasoning.
If you take that and extrapolate it out, I think you're completely correct, right? And I don't think that's the world that we want to live in as a society, right? I just don't think it is.
Exactly. Yes. And from there, then, while we were talking about the controversy surrounding Students for Liberty, there was another matter as well that was coming up. So basically, this friend of mine had pointed out, basically regarding the issue of Islam, for example, she had pointed out that there is a very large amount of evidence pointing to the fact that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, did essentially marry his wife when she was married when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old. Now, she had received a lot of pushback for saying this from the people she had mentioned this to, saying that on the grounds that it's basically offensive, we don't want to really hurt anybody there, people might not respond well to this. And so basically there's kind of a philosophical conversation, I think, to be had there, which is it necessarily morally acceptable to censor people today, whether it's on social media or through firing them from certain organizations? Is it morally acceptable to censor people for offensive views, even if those views are well documented to be true?
So, I mean, that is a good question. I think that the first thing I'll say is I don't think the government should be in the business of deciding and litigating what is offensive and what is not. So at the very minimum, I think we can both agree that the government should not be in the business of deciding what is offensive and what isn't. There are clear rules around free speech that can be enforced. But the decider, having the government sit at the decider of what is offensive and isn't, that seems to me to be problematic. I think that private organizations like again, we talk about the most common cases like Twitter or Facebook that engage in, say censorship of really extreme views. I think that those companies actually, from an economic reason, should have the latitude to make decisions on who they censor and how they censor on their own platforms. I mean, we could talk about what's going on with Twitter right now, where, it seems to, like, what is it? 80% of the advertisers have left because of kind of these like really extreme friends. I mean, I don't know about you, but you go on Twitter nowadays and there's kind of all these anti-Semitic things that are going on, and it makes advertisers uncomfortable. So from a purely economic perspective, I think it's important that private entities and actors have the ability to kind of choose what is allowed on their platform based on their terms of service, right? There's a bigger conversation in society right now around social media companies specifically and the role that they play in our discourse, and how, like, should there be some oversight at all in how those terms of service are set? I don't have an easy answer to that question. If I'm going to be honest with you, Evan, I don't have an easy answer to that question. It's one of the most difficult questions to answer. What is the line? What kind of door do you want to open there, right? Because we talk about the government being the arbiter of what is offensive and what isn't. If the government comes in and makes those kinds of decisions for private actors, that could open up more unintended consequences that could create more harm in the long term than just letting these private actors figure them out and following the economic incentives. So I don't have a really silver bullet answer for you on that. I really just don't. But I do think that like private actors should have the ability in their own spaces to like, if you own a company, to set your own terms of service. If you are a private business and your employee is, spewing pro-Mao stuff or pro-Hitler stuff on social media and it's causing you an economic impact, you probably should be able to, take that down. That would be my like broad-based answer to the question. There's so much nuance there, though. It's very difficult to litigate every single situation, right? And I cannot, because I have no insight into the Students for Liberty situation. I can't speak to that one at all, but that would be like my broad-based answer on that one.
Right. Yes. Yes, and and just a parallel to what you're saying as well, I think we do certainly agree that the government should not have the right to decide, what can be considered offensive or not, or what should be allowed to be said or not, because that's obviously going to have some type of infringement upon the freedom of speech.
For sure.
And of course, there's also, but a parallel to that as well is if we look at private industries, we have non-disclosure agreements, for example. Some people could say that by forcing people not to be able to talk about a certain matter, this could be considered a violation of freedom of speech. But I would say, since this is something that is voluntarily opted into, I don't necessarily see an issue with that.
Right.
And I do believe that if that contract is violated, then yes, you have committed some type of fraud, and that there should necessarily be some type of legal repercussion with that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The voluntary is the key. Now, if it was like, in order to vote, you had to sign, so non-disclosure or something, it could be different. If we're talking about public sector versus private sector, it's a lot different. But yeah, no, I think you raise a good point with that. I actually haven't really thought a lot about the NDA conversation in the context of free speech, but that's definitely an interesting thing to think about.
Right, yes. And basically just one last point regarding Students for Liberty is basically just a way to seg here.
Yeah.
They were also speaking about the issue of military intervention. Basically, if people are calling, being very critical towards a particular side that we're supposed to be sympathetic to, is that something that we should also be allowed to say? So, for example, we currently are seeing, very widespread coverage of the conflicts in Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine. My question for you that I'm curious for is, what is your stance on military intervention? There are obviously views that say that in terms of military defense, emphasis on defense, we're not talking about offense here. Yeah. There are cases where the only time where it would be militarily acceptable for us to take action would be if we are directly under attack. Now, do you see a contradiction between calling for liberty, but also calling for taxpayers to fund deploying soldiers overseas to foreign conflicts?
No, so I look at it like this, and again, this is me speaking purely from my perspective and from the way I look at kind of the application of liberal philosophy. So I look at it like this. The government's job is to, one of the main roles of government is to provide for the national defense, and we all agree with that. In this world that we live in, it is incredibly, and this is not me going after you, Evan, it's just kind of me talking about this idea at large, right? It would be incredibly naive to say, we're going to withdraw from every part of the world. We are going to sit in our little castle, and we're somehow going to be providing for the national defense by just basically sitting around and waiting to be attacked or aggressed on. So I'll get into the more nuance around that because I think that the thing that always bothers me when I talk to libertarians about this is, and this is not again about you. This is just, I've gone to many podcasts and had this conversation. They look at everything in such a black and white way. And when you go to foreign policy, there are so many layers to unpack. It is the grayest of gray, right? The way that you deal with foreign policy is incredibly gray. And I think I could point to a bunch of examples, which we might be able to get to in a minute. So I'll say that, the way that I look at it is, if the government's job is to provide for the national defense, if that's one of the roles of government, which I believe it is, I think we all do, then the way that applies is in a variety of different ways. I think that the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s, when I was coming into high school and coming out of college, was one of the biggest moral travesties. It was an absolute abhorrent decision. I mean, it was based on a lot of falsehoods. There was a massive humanitarian cost. The decision reverberated through the region and made America less safe over time. It was not a net positive for anyone. It did not actually increase the security of the United States. It undermined it, and then it also created a populist backlash to the foreign policy efforts of the Bush administration, which I think led to some of the authoritarian impulses and actually this really radical isolationism, which I think is a very dangerous impulse in American society that's like mainstream now. So I'll say that. But no, I mean, there's no, like, I look at that and say, there is, if the core role of government is to provide the national defense, and you can make a case that taking some sort of action, provides for that national defense, I don't see that as a conflict of principles. I'm assuming you're probably going to want to talk about Russia and Ukraine, because I would think that would be the best example to dig into. Am I correct?
Yes.
So we could go to that. So there's a couple of things there. The first thing is, we made a promise to Ukraine that, and this was in order to get them to give up their nuclear weapons in the 90s, that we would effectively stand to defend their territorial integrity if they were ever aggressed on. So we made a promise as a country to Ukraine when we did that. I think it's important that, first of all, I think it's important that we keep our promises as a country, as a people, to especially our allies. But there is, to the point about national defense and national security, there's absolutely a national security argument, I believe, to be made with the Russian and the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine is being invaded by an aggressive authoritarian invader that's seeking to annex their territory. Ukraine, before they were invaded, made the decision to kind of move closer to the West. Ukraine is strategically very important for European security and at large kind of Western security against Russia specifically. And the work that Ukrainians are doing on the ground right now, they are putting their own lives on the line to effectively bankrupt the Russian war machine and keep that expansion from happening. I think that's an incredibly important thing. I think there's a very powerful strategic argument to be made that it is in the U.S. best interest for our national defense to make sure that Russia remains weak and ineffective. And I think that we also have kind of a moral obligation because we made a promise to Ukraine that we were going to help them protect their territorial sovereignty. If we didn't make the agreement with them to get them to give up their nuclear weapons, this wouldn't be happening. But we did, right? And so I think that we need to kind of come through on that promise. So that would be, I think, the way to apply that. And so I see the national security argument there because we don't live in a world where we get to kind of isolate ourselves. Everyone's interconnected. And Russian activity in Eastern Europe could absolutely do what it did in the, what we saw. It could actually create a situation like what we saw in the 30s where it could spill out to the rest of the world. And that's something that I think is in the best interest of Americans to avoid. And so I think there's, in the same way I wouldn't say it would be morally wrong to say build a road or maybe we could get a nuance there. I don't think it's morally wrong for Congress to make the decision to give them old military equipment and say, we're going to come through on our promise for you and help you guys out in a time where you guys are being killed. Right. So that's the way I look at it.
I do think you make a very good point there when you talk about, the extremely reductive view that many libertarians take towards, foreign involvement.
Yeah.
For example, there is a difference between military presence and necessarily military action.
Right.
We don't necessarily have to talk about soldiers' boots on the ground in other areas, but there should still be some type of action being taken to protect oneself.
And Evan, to that point,
Yes.
like if Germany wants us to have a base there and they want us to be there.
Of course.
Like, I don't see a harm there. Now, if we are illegally occupying a country, right, that's when I would say that's a problem. Like, if they're telling us to get out and we're occupying them, that's when that's an issue. But if our allies say, look, we like having joint security agreements with you guys. We like having you here. We recommend that you stay. I don't see there's any hazard with that. I actually think that's in America's best interest. It's good for our allies. It's good for us. Having a presence overseas, we are the dominant military force for a reason because of our ability to strike anywhere in the world. And I think that improves our national security. And the only time that goes awry is when that machine gets turned into a machine to topple dictators or do, interventions that that cause harm and don't improve America's national security interests. And that's why I'd say that the Ukraine situation, I don't look at nearly as morally equivalent to the situation with Iraq and Afghanistan. And I hear that argument from libertarians all the time. It's like, well, you're just like Dick Cheney because you want to, give Ukraine weapons so that they can defend themselves. It's like, that is not at all the same thing about like going in and invading a foreign country. I mean, that's what Russia's doing, right? And we're trying to keep that from happening. So, not to throw you off on a rabbit hole, Evan, I apologize.
Oh, no, I'm very happy that you bring up Ukraine. As you know, one of the narratives that is often brought up is that, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was motivated by NATO expansion, many people will say.
Yeah.
And the fact does remain that NATO has expanded since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991. Now, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union also meant the end of the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union's equivalent of NATO, essentially. And just to give you one particular example, I do know that several formerly Soviet territories and some previous members of the Warsaw Pact did join NATO back in 2004 alone. I know there was Romania, Estonia, Lithuania, among some others as well, that I can't really recall. And yes, I do know that correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but I do have to ask you, Josh, what do you think is NATO's role in this invasion? And if you believe that it doesn't necessarily play a role, then what is the cause of this invasion? And, like I said, correlation is not causation, so how could you necessarily prove that this did motivate Putin to embark on this conflict?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's clear that and this was from Putin's own words, that he seeks to bring back the old Russian Empire. Like that's one of the things he said publicly many times. I think Putin, when you look at the strategic value of Ukraine, access to the Black Sea and by consequence the Mediterranean, theoretically, there's a very strategic. It is Russia's strategic interest from a military perspective to have control over Ukraine. When you look at, again, Eastern Europe, Ukraine's this flat land, right? There's a wall of mountains that funnel that they could pinch point and defend if they have control over Ukraine. It is strategically important to them, and there's a reason why Russia wants to bring back the old Russian Empire. It's because they're a deeply insecure country that wants to, kind of have that, even at the cost of human lives. The thing I'll say is, NATO expansion, I don't buy the narrative. First of all, NATO expansion, it's almost like saying, I always like this analogy because it's almost like saying that, like, if you and I in a neighborhood decide that if you're my neighbor, Evan, you live next door, and somebody says that I'm going to rob you, or somebody tries to rob you, and you and I make an agreement beforehand that we're going to, like, come to each other's defense if somebody tries to rob us. If that's a threat to you, then you're probably an aggressive criminal. If you and I saying, hey, if somebody comes and attacks us, we're going to have each other's back. If you go, well, that's a threat. Well, then I go, well, you probably have some really aggressive, violent intentions, right? And this is not to say we could go back and forth on the fact that Russia over and over again has downplayed NATO expansion. Like even when Finland and Sweden joined, they were like, oh, it's no big deal, it's fine, whatever. But the idea of, like, from a very broad-based perspective, I look at NATO as the expansion of the non-aggression principle into geopolitics. That's genuinely the way I look at it. Like, if you're aggressed upon, if we're aggressed upon, I should be able to help you come to your defense. And that concept, if that is a threatening concept to you, then you probably have imperialist, violent ambitions. And I think Russia and Putin, I think Putin specifically does have imperialist ambitions. I think it's pretty clear. And again, you can make arguments strategically. I understand strategically why he would want that. But I don't buy that NATO expand. It really just says, oh, it's our fault that Russia is killing Ukrainians. Like somehow it's the Ukrainians' fault. I mean, the Ukraine hasn't, but it's worth noting, Evan, Ukraine has not been able to get into the alliance, at least before 2014, they've been occupied by Russia. There was no moment between 2014 when they annexed Crimea and today where Ukraine was on the precipice of getting into NATO. They have been writ large written out of that for a long time. So actually, and one other thing I'll say is, if Putin wanted to fight NATO expansion, he probably shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, because there's been nothing more that expands NATO like Russian aggression. So, because that's the reason why all her neighbors now are galvanizing against her, is because she's invading people. And I think that's a reasonable response. If I was in Eastern Europe, I would probably want to be part of NATO as well, seeing what happened to Ukrainians. I have friends in Ukraine. I've seen photos of their house. I mean, I couldn't even. Could you even imagine that? Like living with your family in peace, having bombs dropped on your houses, and having to leave your home. I mean, like, I would understand Europeans that are only hundreds of miles away from that saying, well, we probably need to have some sort of plan for this if this happens to us. And so I think that's a reasonable.
Right. Yeah. Yes, I do certainly question the soundness of Putin's logic in deciding to invade Ukraine. I do think that some people take the issue that, for example, they might believe that Putin is paranoid or concerned that he might be anticipating some type of NATO attack against him, where there's not necessarily reason to, but they might say that he's simply distrustful of the nations within NATO.
I mean, Russia tried to get into NATO in 2000.
That is true, yes.
And NATO has not invaded or annexed a country. I mean, you could argue that NATO did the only major military intervention. I think they had some intervention in Libya. I think they did like support for a U.S.-led coalition in Libya. They also were involved in the genocide in, what was it, Serbia? Maybe I'm misremembering this. So it's in the 90s where they intervened to stop a genocide. But I mean, NATO is not invading and annexing countries. NATO doesn't even have a mechanism for that, right? I mean, they have a military alliance that can get brought into this joint coalition, like this military equipment. But like NATO is a purely defensive pact. Like when you read the articles of NATO, there's not a mechanism in there to like say, we're going to all unilaterally decide to invade a country. It's basically a system to say, if one of us gets invaded, we have a mechanism to decide whether we want to all come to each other's defense. That's effectively what NATO is in a nutshell. So I just don't buy that narrative that NATO is a threatening invader. I mean, and to that point, I mean, it's technically true that NATO has been on the borders of Russia since the inception of the alliance, right? I mean, like Alaska is on the border with NATO, which is right there next to their territory. One of the first countries that came to the alliance was Norway. They're on the border with Russia. So it's not like that's anything new that we've been near them, and we haven't, and NATO has not invaded Russia since its inception. So I don't know. I just don't buy the narrative.
I think the Palestine-Israel issue seems to evoke almost a more emotional and personal reaction among Americans. They seem to be, very hung up on that in certain ways. And, I've seen a lot of different takes on this whole conflict, and it's a conflict that's been very long-standing, over the course of decades. Obviously, it didn't just spark overnight on October 7th. So basically, to take one person, I know your friend and colleague Joe Walsh, for example, among other, he tweeted at one point, an attack on Israel is an attack on America. And to be completely honest with you, when I first saw that, my reaction was one of just wincing pretty hard at that statement. But I am kind of curious, though, what your stance is on the Israel and Palestine crisis. Obviously, I don't want to take Joe Walsh's views and necessarily apply them to the whole organization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I said, we've got diverse views on this. When you come into issues like foreign policy, there's a lot of issues where there's diversity within our coalition on kind of how to approach this. I don't think I would say I agree with Joe Walsh's statement that like an attack on Israel is an attack on the United States. If they were in NATO, maybe, but they're not. So I will say this. The situation is incredibly fraught. It is not, I don't think it's as black and white, in my opinion, as like it isn't as clearly black and white as the Ukraine-Russia thing. I will say this, though. I do believe that Israel was attacked by Hamas. Hamas brutally murdered, 1,400 Israelis, raped and pillaged. They have a right as a country to defend themselves. The challenge is that they're going up against Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that has no respect for the people of Gaza, uses them as human shields, and tries to exact the most horrific cost, not only on Israel, but is willing to exact a horrific cost on the Palestinian people in their quest to kind of harm Israel or eradicate Israel as a state. I don't think there will ever be a situation Well, first of all, say if Israel is gone, like if they succeed in destroying Israel, we'll see massive amounts of violence. To that point, I don't think that we should see an end to Gaza and the Palestinian people and eradication of them. I don't think Israel wants to see that. But I will say that, there have been missteps made on the Israeli government part. There have been operations that have gone wrong and civilians have died. This has happened also in any conflict. But it's a very difficult situation that Israel is dealing with. Like that is not a conflict that is easy for them to navigate. So I think the solution has to be some sort of a two-state solution. It has to be a return to hopefully at some point a ceasefire and agreement. But I think that the hostages need to come home, and I think that until that happens, this is going to continue to be a really, really tragic humanitarian crisis, and it's really, really shameful. It's really sad to see this play out. It's sad to see. To see the absolute suffering that's happening in Gaza right now, and I know that really one of the biggest enemies to the success of the Palestinian people is Hamas, and so I look at that situation. I go that it's very difficult to prescribe a solution to that. I mean, we're basically trying to solve something that hasn't been able to be solved for decades, but. That would be my 10,000. That would be my answer to the way that I look at the conflict. I would like to see a return to peace. I'd like to see a return of the hostages, and I would like to see a focus on humanitarian. Making sure that the people, the actual civilians of Gaza, are taken care of on both sides. Both Israelis aren't harmed and caught in the crossfire as well as innocent Gazans, but it's or innocent Palestinians. But it's a very fraught situation.
I do see that Hamas is very much hurting their own cause for the Palestinian people. But basically, having addressed that, kind of touching upon these military conflicts, I do just want to ask you point blank, do you think that the U.S. should stop, using tax-funded money in these foreign conflicts? Do you think that America has justifiable reason to do so?
I think that if the American people through their representative in Congress decide that they want to, say, provide aid to Ukraine or to Israel or humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, for God's sakes, I think that those things should be able to be done through the legislative bodies of Congress. I think it should be done through Congress. I don't agree with the idea of a unilateral executive that's going in and writing checks on behalf of the American people. I think there needs to be representation and there needs to be a deliberative process there to make those decisions. But to the point that we mentioned a second ago, this is all very black and white. It's very difficult to draw a broad-based black and white rule here. But I don't think that ending all foreign military and humanitarian aid writ large would be in the best interest of America's national security. And so I think that it is reasonable to say that we should have those discussions through our representatives in Congress and make those decisions. And if our representatives decide to do so, I don't think there's any conflict with even libertarian philosophy to that end.
Okay. And yes, I understand. And now that we've kind of spoken on the people in Congress, spoken on the political side, I do think it is, definitely worth discussing the upcoming 2024 election. So I kind of want to speak on public policy on a bit of a larger scale here, talking about the current race we're seeing between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So, we've recently, for example, just the other night, we saw the debate between Trump and Harris. And there was a lot to take in there. I admit that I was personally left scratching my head at talk of immigrants eating pets and whatever issues were coming up. But I am a bit curious what your overall perspective is on that particular debate and what difference you think it could potentially make to the race itself, or if it even could make a difference.
Yeah, I think it has in the polling, just that we've seen in the last 48 hours, it seems to have given her a marginal uptick. I mean, it's worth noting that if you hated Trump already, it's probably not. That debate definitely didn't change your mind. I think it did take a lot of people on the fence and make them realize just how low energy and old that Trump is getting. He's obviously way past his prime, and he's having cognitively a very difficult time. So I think that at the minimum, it might show people that he came across as very deranged, very unhinged. He came across as very self-absorbed. One of the moments that I thought was very powerful and this spoke, I thought this was a masterstroke, and I think a lot of people online would agree with me on this, is when Kamala Harris, I think it was a question about his bread and butter issue, it was about border security, and Kamala kind of answered the question and then pivoted into the rallies. She kind of demeaned his rallies. And at the end of her statement, she said, Trump has no vision or plan for you, doesn't care about you. And then he proved her point by spending his entire time talking about how great his rallies were. And I think it just kind of shows he's a malignant narcissist, and he is very self-absorbed, in cognitive decline. And I think that came through in the debate. And so I think that moved some people away from him, which I thought was probably a positive thing.
And on that note, on the note of, moving away from Trump and moving towards Kamala in that case, to be honest, let's face it, you are one of the comparatively few in the liberty movement who is openly endorsing Kamala Harris for president. Mm-hmm. I do know that after this debate, you did have a public statement along the lines of, the death of MAGA at the hands of an intelligent, accomplished black woman is the epitome of poetic justice.
Yep.
I know that these are roughly your words.
That is it.
Yep. And in that case, considering that, if we're being honest here, a lot of people are going to hear that statement and they're going to roll their eyes at it. What is your response to them? What is the case that you would make overall for voting for Kamala Harris?
That's a great question. I think that the case that I make is very, very simple. Donald Trump has abdicated his oath. He's violated his oath to the Constitution. He is a threat to the Constitution because of that. He has authoritarian impulses. And he has objectively failed on every measure that we would hold a pro-liberty candidate to, like hard stop. Trump, really the reason. So I think that one thing I'll say is this: my decision to support Kamala Harris is actually less about policy, although I think you could make a policy argument to say that Kamala has more, say, liberal policies than Trump does. And it's mainly due to that basic fact. When I look at a presidential candidate, I say, first and foremost, will they uphold their oath to the Constitution of the United States? If the answer is yes on both sides, then we can have a conversation about policy and nuance and then get into the weeds. I have never voted for a Democrat in my entire life. I voted actually Libertarian every year since I was 18 years old. I wasn't a member of the Libertarian Party until like 2016, but I voted for a Libertarian every year since 18.
Smart man.
2012. Huh?
Smart man.
Yeah. And so the reason I made the decision this year is because I looked at the candidates and I said, can both these candidates uphold their oath to the Constitution? After January 6th, I do not believe the answer is a yes for Trump. And so I think that we're in a moment where there's kind of a moral choice to be made, where we have to say, it is of utmost importance that we do not allow someone like him to get near the Oval Office again. Like, that is a critical moment in history that we just have to make a decision and make some concessions. I mean, Trump, this is all out in the public. He drafted plans to replace legitimate electors with fake electors. He tried to push this through. His team had plans to go in and across the country and seize voting machines. He objectively called to terminate the Constitution, all the rules of its Constitution. He pressured Pence for months to violate his constitutional duty to certify the electors sent by the states. And when he didn't, he incited insurrection that called for Pence to be hung. I mean, the insurrectionists were hundreds of feet away from Pence. What would have happened if they would have gotten to him? Like, it would have been a very different day, right? I can't look at that situation and go, well, we need to just have a conversation about policy, because that is the bare minimum that I come to expect from leaders. So I look at this and I go, now it's time for us to, I'm going to put those differences that I have with Kamala aside, and I think we should back the person that has the most likely opportunity to make sure this dude cannot ever get near power. I actually think it's very important that it's a blowout election, because if it's another close election, there's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be more schemes to call the election fake. This could be a constitutional crisis in the making. So I think it's very important that it's just a complete blowout against him, and then we can get back to an environment, like a normal political environment, where we have candidates that are kind of like at least have a willingness to uphold their oath, and then we can actually start doing the work to reform the parties from the inside and actually move things in the right direction. That is truly my reasoning. Like, that's truly the core of my reasoning. there are things that Trump did, and this would have been my argument against him. This was my argument for why I didn't vote for him in 2016, 2020. There are many things that he did that were completely out of step with pro-liberty ideas. I mean, like, he shut down the economy during COVID and then attacked governors that were trying to reopen the economy. He killed more civilians in drone strikes than any other president before him, including Biden, and after, including Biden. He ended all the rules that Obama set up to like transparently report them. So we don't actually know the scope of the civilian deaths. That's through independent reporting. He didn't end any wars. He passed more gun control than any president in modern history, printed more money than any president in modern history. He wants to expand civil asset forfeiture and give universal qualified immunity to every police officer. He wants to round up immigrants, 12 million immigrants, and put them in camps and deport them. I mean, violent. I mean, you talk. There's the only way you do that is going door to door with police. And then, you know, we know, I think you and I do, Evan, that money printing does lead to inflation. He printed half of all the dollars in existence in 2021. Half of all the dollars ever printed were printed in 2021. And Donald Trump signed his names on the checks, sent it to everyone. So I look at like his record, and then I look at his violation of his oath, and I go, this guy's just, there's no upside. There's no upside to him as a candidate, not only policy-wise, but like we need to make sure that he's not a part of the national conversation anymore. So that's my reason.
Many do also point out the idea that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has also greatly, you know, skewed certain inflation figures towards the end of Trump's presidency, as well as at the beginning of Biden's as well.
Yeah, for sure. And Biden spent a lot of money too, which I'm sure aided in inflation, driving it up when he took over. So I can't say he didn't do any, you know, spending there. There were more checks, more spending.
Sure. And, you know, in this case, we know full well Kamala Harris is not going to be ending the Federal Reserve, obviously. No. So, and in fact, she's also had a bit of a lack of transparency regarding her platform. I do know that certain people have recommended to her to actually not even reveal her plans until after the election. But in this case, do you think that Kamala Harris is going to be able to tackle the current inflation crisis? Why or why not?
I think that she'll do a better job of tackling the inflation crisis than Trump will. I think I can argue that very strongly. So there's two reasons why. The first reason is her budget proposal is adds 5 times less to the deficit than Trump's does. And that's a lot to do to the fact that he's trying to implement these universal tariffs. I mean, anyone that understands economics understands that a 10% tariff on everything imported to the United States would be like the most inflationary policy you could devise. I mean, with the exception of sending checks to everyone and doubling the federal budget overnight, 10% added to the price of every import would be one of the most inflationary policies I could imagine, like, period. So I don't think Trump has a solution to address inflation. I think he's I don't think he even, based on the debate, I don't even think he understands what a tariff even is. Like, I'm shocked he didn't say that, but like he had said that the countries pay tariffs, like as though that money doesn't get bled back to the American consumer who's going to have the price increase of the product to cover the cost of the tariff when the person imports it. So that's incredibly inflationary. Harris's budget is adds 5 times less to the deficit than Trump's does. And one of the things that I've been happy to see, and I don't know if you've read this yet, Evan, but I mean, Harris did release her policy platform like a couple days ago.
Oh, yes, I was looking at that. Yes, that's right.
So there's some stuff in there that's not great. Like, we talk about price gouging laws, price gouging rules, which I don't think address the core supply and demand problems the economy lead to shortages. There was stuff in there around housing, around like giving checks or giving credit to everyone who bought a house, which I think would also do the same thing, which is add way more cost to the housing market. But there's a lot of other things in there that are great, specifically around housing. This idea that we're going to tear down rules and regulations and the federal government is going to do what they can to work with local municipalities to like reduce rules and regulations that make it harder to build more homes. We know that the way you fix the housing crisis is by increasing the supply of housing. That's how you fix the problem. The fact that she understands that, that is like one of the number one inflationary drivers right now in the economy is the price of housing. It's just going through the roof. And the fact that she's talking about that is a huge win. She did also talk about cutting taxes for middle-class families, which I don't I mean, I think that's great. Cutting taxes is awesome. And I think that's a fantastic thing. And so this kind of pivot I'm seeing from the Democratic Party, where they're kind of, it seems to me like they're moderating a bit and embracing more of the supply side voices rather than these kind of progressive economic protectionist voices, these economic populists. That's a really good thing for the economy, for driving down inflation, for fixing real problems rather than making them worse. And while I see Kamala moderating on that, I see Trump doing the opposite. He's like, he's going for universal tariffs. You know, he's going for economic protectionism. And he even was at a rally a couple weeks ago talking about how his number one goal is to protect single family zoning. I mean, this was in this whole Project 2025 thing that he said he doesn't know about. I mean, single family zoning, the idea that you can only build these single unit, that's a huge driver to the cost of housing. And if we're going to like protect that at all costs without building higher density, that's not going to reduce pricing for anyone. That's going to make things way worse. So, I mean, that's like artificially controlling the supply of housing in order to help your personal investments at the cost of like poor young people that are coming out of college that need to be able to afford to buy a home. They can't do that because of these rules and regulations like single family zoning and other things. So I don't know. I actually think she has I really do objectively believe that she has a better plan to address the deficit, to address inflation, and to address some of the supply problems that we have in the economy that are leading to the inflation problems that we have.
I mean, in regards to what you were saying, you know, with Trump's position on tariffs, for example, I do remember hearing at one point that he was floating a certain idea. I believe it was something, it may have been something as large as abolishing the income tax and replacing it with a larger tariff. And while obviously, you know, somebody in my position loves the idea of, you know, the income tax being completely abolished, but yeah, I do realize that, you know, if he's talking about replacing it with tariffs, that's still far from the ideal solution that many of the people, you know, who heard it were making it out to be.
Yeah, and I don't. Trump said a lot of things. I mean, dude, when he got elected in 2016, he put out. I was looking for this the other day and I couldn't find it. For God's sakes, I don't know why I couldn't find this. I need to find this document. He put out this document a week before he got elected of all these in 2016 of all these promises he was going to make. He made that he was going to commit. One of them was like getting rid of term limits, and there's all these kind of weird things he does. I mean, Trump has a very bad record of keeping his promises, so I wouldn't hold him to that one. And he's also inherently a populist, so he's willing to just say whatever. So even people that, I mean, here's the thing, though. I don't think you're going to address the national debt by abolishing income tax. I was talking to one of our advisors, Jason Pai, who does a lot of work in this space, and he's like, you know, we're basically at a point fiscally where you can't cut taxes and get rid of the debt, period. You can't. So you got to choose one. Either you're going to go full-blown populist, cut all everyone's taxes, right, and have the deficit explode, or you're going to take a real approach. It's actually really, really difficult because libertarian. How would you solve that with libertarian philosophy? Like, I guess you just abolish the entire government, and maybe that would be the way.
Yes, I mean,
but even with cuts, you can't get to where you need to because it's all entitlement. I mean, I guess you could get rid of everyone's entitlements and just cut them all off immediately, but that's not politically expedient. But yeah, I don't think it's likely that he's going to do anything of that nature. And I actually think that would be worse because then you would have, you know, a massive drop off in imports or a higher cost in imports. I haven't looked at the math. I'm not an economist, so I don't know exactly what the math is on that, but that seems a little bit economically unviable to me. And also, do you want to really tie your tax base to like trade? Exactly. You know what I mean? Like what happens if we have a war or something? And you know what I mean? And all that shuts down or another pandemic. What happens? You know, when that happens. So I think that's dangerous. But
I'm definitely not in love with the idea of, you know, Trump's tariff base or anything like that. I've personally leaned more towards leaders such as Javier Milei. I don't think that either, you know, Trump or Harris necessarily are on that particular level.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think Milei's done a lot of good things. I mean, his approach is to eliminate bureaucracy and regulation, tear down barriers to free trade. When I look at, I actually put a tweet out about this like last year that kind of went viral. Like almost everything about Milei's economic agenda is not at all Trump's economic agenda. Right. They're like very different. Like they're not at all the same. Trump's whole goal is to like capture the regulatory state and use it to enforce his will. and then throw up barriers to the rest of the world. Milei is like, no, we're going to abolish the regulatory state and we're going to trade with everyone and we're going to try to be more efficient and grow with our tax base in order to pay our obligations. Like that's a liberal solution economically, I think. That's not Trumpism. That's like the opposite of Trumpism. It's always weird to me that they kind of find themselves on the same side of the political
Yes.
So go back to when all you do is hate the left. I guess you kind of find weird allies, but I don't know. I digress.
Yes, I have long seen Trump as more of a symbol than any concrete bringer of actual change or the actual ideology that he professes to hold.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
yeah, no, I agree. I think that's pretty dangerous, man. Like, I think that I think he has reached the point of basically cult leader kind of model. I don't see that same thing with Kamala. Give me an example. When Joe Biden just completely fell on his face at the debate, there was a civil, reasonable conversation on the left about what to be done about that. And it obviously ended up with Joe Biden stepping down and somebody else taking the place. And there was an alignment around the Democratic coalition around Kamala. Could have gone a million different ways, but there was an open conversation. It wasn't like, no, Biden did an amazing job and it was the moderators that screwed him over. It really wasn't that. Or like Trump had magical earrings in his ears that made him kick Biden's ass, or there wasn't this weird conspiracy fantasy stuff that I'm seeing coming out of the right. I think that makes him absolutely more dangerous as a political leader than Kamala, because at least within the Kamala's coalition, there's disagreement. They're united right now in around defeating Trump. But I assure you, as soon as that happens, there's going to be a civil war on the left around whether the economic populists or the economic liberals are going to win. That's going to be the fight that happens after November. Within the Republican Party, it's basically like either you get on the Trump train and everything Trump says is good, or you get out. I mean, think about the red flag laws thing when he said, take the guns first. You remember this in like 2017, and he was sitting at that round table with Mike Pence, and he was like, no, I want to take the guns first, and we'll go through due process later.
Yes.
The fact that there was just like, oh yeah, this is the way we're going to go now. And since then, it's only gotten to be more culty. I think that's really, really dangerous, because if Trump says tomorrow that he's going to take everyone's guns, which, by the way, he has passed more gun control than any other president, he could probably get that passed with a Republican Congress, whereas the Democrats are not going to have that. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be the gun owners caucus within the Democratic Party. The Republicans are never going to get on board. It would be far harder for Kamala to get things done, whereas the Republican Party is united around one principle, and that's whatever Donald Trump says is correct. And I think that's a really dangerous political instinct. It's a very, very dangerous for like freedom and individual liberty to have just one guy dictate the policy agenda of an entire party and no one can be questioned it. I think it's very dangerous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel like we have addressed, Trump. I also do kind of want to shift this to Kamala's case as well.
Yeah.
For example, I do know that, just to take one particular example, I do know about 5 years ago in the presidential debates, there was a very infamous moment where Tulsi Gabbard criticized Kamala Harris's record back when she was a prosecutor. She did point out that Harris played a pretty sizable role in 1,500 people, thereabouts, imprisonment for marijuana offenses, and simultaneously also laughed off the question when she was asked about her own marijuana usage. And Gabbard also pointed out that there was an instance of Harris blocking, I believe, a death row inmate, who she was essentially blocking the evidence that would be released to save him on death row. Fortunately, though, the courts did supersede her and force that evidence to be released. And also, yes, she did accuse Kamala of keeping inmates imprisoned after the end of their sentences in order to use them for essentially cheap prison labor.
I remember this. Yeah.
Yes. This particular criticism sounds as though Kamala Harris was almost enabling slavery among these inmates. And finally, she also pointed out Harris's actions in preserving the cash bail system that also put a rather significant burden on poor families. So a lot of people have heard this, and they're inherently distrustful when Harris claims that she'll act differently as president of the United States. So basically, having laid all of this out, I do feel as though I have something of a responsibility to ask, do you have a particular rebuttal to Tulsi Gabbard's critique of Kamala Harris's actions as prosecutor?
No, I think that those were mistakes that she made. And there's no perfect candidate in this race by any means. As I said, there's many things that Kamala has done in her career and that she's gone on record for that I disagree with. Many of those things I would also disagree with. I did disagree with them in 2019 when I heard them brought up, right? I just think that, again, there is no perfect situation. As somebody who comes from a libertarian tradition and understands that we as a movement have a hard time looking at things in the gray, I will say that like a woman like Kamala, who at least I have confidence is going to uphold her oath and commit the peaceful transfer of power and, go through facilitate the democratic norms that we've come to expect from our leaders. Because she's got a couple, she's made mistakes as a prosecutor. It doesn't change my calculation. Like, I mean, just not to go to Trump, because I know that that's what everyone does is, well, what about Trump? But I would say like the idea that the humanitarian cost of rounding up 11 million people is going to be so profound. If he actually achieves that goal, we talk about some inmates that were left in prison. We're talking about 11 million people that are going to have their lives upended and be literally put into camps, according to Trump, violently deported, police going community to community to find these people. I just don't see them as morally equivalent. And I would say strongly that I would say it's very important to critique Kamala's record and make sure that she moves away from the more illiberal things that she's done in the past. I am happy to see that she is doing that. And I know that that's probably because she's a cynical politician. She's doing what she needs to do to maybe win. And maybe she doesn't have very deep personal views. She's just kind of more political opportunist. But that is the world that we find ourselves in. So that would be my response to maybe that critique specifically. I do remember that moment in the debate in 2019. That was a pretty viral moment, if I recall correctly.
Right. Basically, going off of these particular criticisms of Kamala, if we apply this through one of the values that I know Project Liberty holds very dear, the value of democracy, for example.
Yeah.
We can talk about January 6th. That is obviously often cited as an attack on America's democracy. I'm sure from what you're saying that seems to have certainly influenced your decision to vote against Donald Trump. And we can also say too, there's also some type of an issue with the movement to remove Donald Trump from ballots, for example, and somehow claiming that protects democracy when, if anything, you would say that seems to be very much antithetical to it. There's also the case that, Kamala Harris herself was not necessarily chosen, by anybody when she became the nominee. She's not necessarily voted for. She kind of just came to it through a direct result of Biden stepping down. Do you believe necessarily that there is some type of contradiction in the concept of democracy and supporting Kamala Harris or Donald Trump for that matter?
Yeah. So I actually went on record when they were pulling Trump's name off the ballot. I think it was Colorado did this. I do think that was a mistake. I think if he was convicted for those crimes, then we would have a conversation. But I think that the overturning of that and keeping him on the ballot was the right decision. Also, I don't think that would have been sound for the health of our society to have him removed from the ballot as a major party nominee or presumptive nominee at the time. I also have gone on record against the Democratic Party's efforts to effectively push the needle in their own primary. I don't think that's very democratic. I actually was on a podcast last week with a group of social democrats and progressives, and they were making the same critique you were about how they basically shut down the primaries. I mean, what was the guy's name?
Kyle Kalinske?
No, it was Kyle Kalinske that I was talking to. But what was the guy that ran in the primary against Trump? Oh, my goodness. Dean Phillips. I mean, Dean Phillips was talking about this for a long time, and he was saying we need to have a competitive primary. And he was kind of shut out of that. And I think that he was a bit prophetic because what we saw with Biden showed that they needed to have a competitive primary, right? So no, I think that the pursuit of democracy, the pursuit of any individual freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, it's not a straight line, but directionally we need to make sure all the parties move in a direction where democracy is more representative. So that means more transparent and open primaries. That means tearing down rules like restrictive ballot access rules that keep minor parties from competing. That means opening up primaries. So not only having primaries competitive and transparent, but also allowing people to vote in primaries, moving into different primaries and doing jungle primaries and other options that would make that more representative. I think ranked choice voting is a great solution, or approval voting, or proportional representation. I think any one of those three things would be directionally better from a democratic perspective than what we have now. So I can say this: the thing that is really annoying, but also a feature, maybe feature is the wrong word, of our democratic systems, is that the parties are private entities. So the parties operate privately. This is the way that they work. So they do technically have the latitude to make their own rules on how they run their own primaries. I mean, as somebody who's chaired a state party, we had the latitude to make our rules on how we nominated our candidates. So I don't think that's like morally wrong. I think it would actually be more morally wrong for like a state government to come in and remove candidates from the ballot, like what they did with Trump. I think that's pretty screwed up. Then maybe like the Democratic Party changing their rules. I will say Kamala did get the nomination. She was on the ballot as the vice presidential candidate when the primaries happened, so she did get votes that way. The delegates at the convention nominated her, and that is the system and mechanism that they use to get her nominated. So I don't necessarily buy the whole narrative that like she was like pushed in as like some sort of anti-democratic candidate, because I think there was a process that brought her there. But I think that the process could absolutely be improved, both in the Republicans and Democratic Party. And then you and I know this very well as well. Both those parties work together to block any alternative on the ballot.
Right. The uniparty.
Yeah, exactly. We call it the uniparty or the duopoly or whatever you might want to call it. That is one thing that Republicans and Democrats do work together on. It's to kind of keep their own monopoly on power and make sure that they're the only two voices. And I think that's wrong. I mean, again, I'm voting Democrat. I'm going to be voting Democrat for the first time in my life this year, joining that system. That would be a critique I'd make. That's not healthy for democratic systems whatsoever. It's just not.
What you're speaking on there as far as the duopoly, this need to consolidate power, the uniparty, this also leads me to another point I want to make in regards to democracy. We've spoken about it for a while here. I think it's also interesting to kind of put this idea on trial for a moment. For example, democracy is clearly, not only a crucial idea to you, but also to Project Liberal as a whole.
Yeah.
There are people, many of them within the libertarian movement, who see democracy as something of a wolf in sheep's clothing. The anarcho-capitalist Hans Hermann Hoppe, for example, has written very extensively against democratic forms of government, most notably in his book, Democracy, the God That Failed. Mm-hmm. And among his claims, he's said that, a democracy, for example, would have a higher time preference than a monarchy. As a counterexample, democratic leaders don't own the government, so they have less incentive to think about the long term than a king, who would be responsible for his government for a much longer amount of time. And as for some people who might argue that, well, can't a lousy government just be voted out? He has also stated that it is in that democratic government's interest to buy votes, essentially, by appealing to the poor with welfare benefits, for example, that could be paid for by the rich. And if democracy does depend on the majority, and these poor people can be bought off with welfare, democratic politicians then would naturally be incentivized to keep the number of poor people as high as possible. And that's Hoppe's case. One observation I would like to make, and one that I'm a bit curious about, and I'm wondering if you can, address this for me.
Yeah.
If treating democracy as an intrinsic aspect of liberty does seem to be, it almost seems to cheapen the meaning of liberty in a way. After all, because I see liberty as an objective state of affairs, and under democracy, liberty almost seems to be redefined as what the most people vote for. If the majority of people were, for example, to vote for a certain subgroup within society to be very brutally and overwhelmingly taxed, we could potentially claim from there that it could still be passed off as a free and just society, simply because it had been arrived at democratically, and that the people had been given a voice in making this decision. So with this kind of laid out, how do you essentially respond to the Hoppian critique of democracy?
That's a great question. So first, actually, I'll talk about the 2 points you brought up, and then let's talk a bit about just that meaning of liberty thing. Because I actually think there's something to that. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It is an interesting intellectual exercise, I guess, but I cannot think about a monarch somehow. Monarchs aren't thinking about the future. They're thinking about themselves, right? Monarchs are thinking about how they can enrich themselves and benefit themselves. When you give centralized power and authority to individuals, we understand this is the way humans operate. They're selfish. They seek to benefit themselves. I think that concept that somehow a monarch is going to think about the future and not think about how he can use the levers and tools of ultimate power over a society to benefit himself on the backs of the people that he's controlling is like not only incredibly naive, but I couldn't even think about an analogy throughout history. Maybe you could point to a handful of like good Roman Empire emperors or something that like did great for a couple of years. But almost every single story about monarchy is not a story about, you know, the great enrichment of these societies and these these wonderful free people that go out. It's a story of tyranny. It's a story of one individual having ultimate control, ultimate ownership. It's the antithesis of a free society. It does not fit into a framework like that. The other thing I'll say, this idea that that monarchy or democracy is incentivizes the people, keeping people poor so that they're relying on welfare, is lunacy. Look at history. The advent of liberal democracy created the most freedom and prosperity for the poor and middle class that we have seen in human history. Liberal democracy, which came out of the Enlightenment, brought more people out of poverty and into economic, personal prosperity, freedom than any other system devised by man, period. That was not done. I mean, monarchs had thousands of years to figure that problem out. They did not. The decentralization of political power out of the hands of a few and the expansion of political freedom into the hands of many has been objectively one of the greatest political innovations of the modern time. I will say, though, to your point, there is this problem, and we've talked about this internally, around framing democracy as a good in and of itself. And I actually think there, and maybe I'm misreading your point, so tell me if I'm off base, but I think that you're actually correct in a way. The pursuit of democracy is not necessarily a good thing in and of itself. The reason that's the case is because, like, we know democracy is a flawed system, just like monarchy or any of the others. They are flawed systems. But democracy is the least flawed of all the systems. It's like the alternative to democracy is effectively monarchy or tyranny or these other strongman dictatorial systems. So when I talk about it, we've actually spoken about this a lot. It's not that we're pursuing democracy. It's that we're pursuing political and individual freedom. We're pursuing a system where people have the control or the ability to insert themselves and have control over the way their government runs and how it to control the scope of its involvement in their lives, right? And have a voice there. So really, liberalism is a pursuit of political freedom, and democracy is just simply like the system that comes out of that. And I don't think that a framework that says we must abolish the levers, the mechanism for people to have political freedom and political attitude in their lives will in any way lead to more prosperity, more freedom, and a better society. I, in fact, think we've already seen that story. And that story was thousands of years of poverty, of destitution, of abuse, of tyranny. And thanks to liberal democracy and the Enlightenment and the limitations put on power, the movement from it being run by a man and relying on the consent of the governed, was an incredible achievement for humanity. And I don't think we should abandon that by any means. That's one of the reasons why I use full-throated embrace of liberal democracies, because I think it was a very powerful tool to improve people's lives, you know.
To your point, you know, roughly I know what Hoppe and many of his peers will say in regards to, let's say, the benefits that have been brought with, you know, simultaneously with these establishment of these liberal democracies. They might claim that this is, in their view, a post hoc fallacy. They might claim that, you know, around this time that this was established, there had been great maybe industrial advancements, steps forward in that regard. And they might argue that in the sense, you know, the improvement of the standard of living was happening despite these democracies rather than because of them. They might also claim that, you know, even if these kings are acting in their self-interest, the king's desire to act in his self-interest would, as a secondary consequence, also benefit the life of the people in his nation. But this is basically the rough outline of Hoppe's case.
Well, I mean, I would say that the advent of political freedom and economic freedom and individual freedom, the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, you can't separate those things. So, like, this is the same thing I talk to the social democrats about. It's this idea. This is the problem, I think, with illiberal philosophies, is they say, okay, freedom's a good thing, but only in this, like, okay, this is what social democrats will do. They say freedom's a good thing, but only when it comes to social issues. Like people should be free to do what they want with their own bodies and move and all these things and choose who they marry. That's great, but not economic freedom. And on the right nowadays, I'm seeing it like, economic freedom is good, although with some exceptions. We just talked about how they're rejecting economic openness and all that. But let's just say Reagan era, right? Economic freedom is good, but maybe, political freedom should be tampered a little bit. Maybe certain groups should have more rights than other groups or more power over society. Or maybe you shouldn't be able to choose what you have in your body and we're not going to. That philosophy, that just does not work. Freedom is a good concept. Expanding freedom, more political, economic, and personal freedom to more people is what creates prosperity, period. So this idea that you're going to separate those things is basically it's basically like woke. It's like woke libertarianism. It just makes no sense to me. It's the same arguments I hear from the Bernie bros. Like, well, social liberalism is good, but economic liberalism is bad. It's like, well, Hoppians almost say, in a way, they actually say all of them are bad. Actually, we didn't really think about it, but and so I would say that, and political freedom, I don't think you could separate those things. I mean, the enfranchisement of more people has led to more prosperity. Those things happen all at the same time because it was a governing, overarching philosophy of individual freedom. It applies to all those different axes. Those things are the magic secret sauce, that created more prosperity. There's a reason why the United States is the most prosperous country in the world, and it's because we've tried to realize that vision and apply it to every element of society. We haven't done perfect, but it's not like, the enfranchisement of more people have led to a more we are still the most prosperous country in the world. Like, as we've expanded suffrage and enfranchisement to more people, we've continued to grow and succeed and be more prosperous. And so I don't, we should probably have a podcast episode just for Hoppianism, because this is a whole topic and we're getting to 2 hours. But
well, yes,
yeah.
I thank you. And I do appreciate, you laying that out there. Now, in regards, though, I do know, since we are approaching the 2-hour mark, there is one last issue facing Americans that I wanted to speak on.
Let's do it.
And that is healthcare.
Okay.
So then this is a deeply divisive issue in this country. I mean, healthcare is generally getting higher in price and lower in quality each year. And ironically, this seems to be happening despite governments around the world pumping billions into their respective healthcare industries, whether this is through nationalization or subsidies or some mixture of both. So then I'm just curious, what in your view would be the ideal system of healthcare, and how is the U.S. currently falling short of this ideal?
I like to say we should embrace a YIMBY approach to healthcare. It's something I took from someone else that is in our Project Liberal group. The problems with healthcare are too much bureaucracy, too much red tape, and terrible, terrible, terrible incentives. I think that you could fix a lot of the problems by fixing our occupational licensing system, by requiring price transparency when you're engaging in operations and engaging with other, say, medical procedures. This idea, like I was actually reading something about this the other day. There is literally an artificial cap put on physicians and doctors in this country. We have a artificial restriction that blocks people from being able to enter the medical profession in order to keep salaries high for existing doctors. And what that does is radically increase costs. And it's bureaucratic red tape that is not at all following market incentives. We all know that when the income tax was created, they had this whole loophole about how insurance wasn't counted as taxable income, which created this crazy incentive for healthcare in the United States to be done through the employer because it was not taxed. And that created this weird unintended consequence where there's all this healthcare insecurity. So there's all these little things that I think need to be addressed. But really, in a nutshell, I think the way you solve that problem is you bring back market incentives. I think price transparency, tearing down barriers to enter the profession or barriers to provide service as a good model. And then a model that I really like is this concept of, if we could reinvent the healthcare system, what it should be is a combination of catastrophic insurance and direct primary care. So when you have a car, you have car insurance for your car that covers catastrophic problems, right? Liability, or I'm sorry, full coverage insurance. If you go and hit a tree and your car's totaled and you have to buy a new car, that covers that. Our insurance doesn't cover our oil changes. or our gas every week, right? I think those two things should be separated. I think it's the same. You took that same model and kind of scaled it up to personal insurance. What it would look like is you have catastrophic insurance for, let's say you get cancer or you get in a car accident and you have to go to the ER and you have this crazy amount of money. Have that as an option, and have that as a lower cost option that's easy to access across multiple markets that you could buy. I mean, there's some people, believe it or not, in our community that are arguing that the government you should have private options, and then the government should have just a very basic option as well, like just provide that basic catastrophic option. I don't have a strong opinion either way on this, but as long as there's a private option, that's the key. There needs to be a private catastrophic option, and then have direct primary care, where you could pay a small monthly fee, which already exists, to go to a physician or somebody who can go check your kids, check you, do your routine maintenance, do your oil changes, right? And have that as a separate plan, rather than having all of it rolled up in this amalgamous black box of bureaucracy and red tape where you don't know what you're paying and why you're paying it, and you don't know who you can go to because who's in your coverage or not. I am not an expert by any means on healthcare, so if you ask me to talk about this for like 20 more minutes, I'll probably not be able to give you much. But I think that, like, at the very minimum, the problem from the people that I've spoken to who are far more intelligent than I am is a problem of overregulation, of no market incentives. And if you can fix a lot of those individual problems, then you can fix a lot of the issues and make insurance affordable for people again.
Right, yes. And, the anarcho-capitalist in me often looks to the fraternal lodges that existed back in the 19th century, where we had these lodges established where the costs were much lower. And basically, historically, if we look at organizations such as Mooseheart, for example, there was a much lower cost. People who belonged in these lodges were able to get their health care in a very easy, accessible way. Once the government became involved, suddenly we saw these doctors being discredited as quacks, allegedly. And from there, there began to be some type of protectionism. You kind of, lean towards that when you talk about your occupational licenses there. Yeah. And this type of protectionism also raises prices. I've also found that a lot of people tend to label the U.S. healthcare system as privatized, and this tends to typically come from people who are critical of the private sector. And I would argue that it is deeply erroneous to blame this country's shortcomings in healthcare on private industry. For example, just to provide some context, the United Kingdom has nationalized healthcare through the NHS. And what's interesting about this, though, is that despite the UK system being nationalized, despite it being public, and the US as being quote-unquote private, the US government actually spends more money on the individuals per capita than the UK.
Yep.
So as a result of this, American healthcare companies lose the incentive to keep their costs low. And this trend is also reflected in the fact that, the amount of healthcare administrators are increasing at a much more rapid pace than the amount of actual physicians. And Ludwig von Mises alluded to this, same point basically in his book Bureaucracy. Government laws on intellectual property have allowed these drug companies to gain a monopoly as well. So naturally prices skyrocket from there. So, I basically see a lot of this as, the driving force behind what is wrong with the U.S. healthcare system.
A great book I'd recommend by a good friend of mine, Michael Cannon from the Cato Institute, called Recovery. He actually sits down in this book and kind of goes step by step on the reforms that could be made to our healthcare system to address many of the problems that you just mentioned. And I think the featured graph in his book is or maybe it's not the featured graph in his book, but he points to it because we had him on the podcast, on the Project Liberal podcast it was about a year ago, right when the book came out. Is that chart, that notorious chart that shows all these developed countries and the amount of money they spend per capita, and then the United States is just this crazy outlier on healthcare. And you're completely correct in the fact that it's not a fully private free market healthcare system, period. That's not what it is. It's just not. There are so many artificial restrictions and barriers. On the drug stuff, that would be a whole nother conversation that we'd have to come back to when we have more time on intellectual property, because that's a whole beast in of itself. But I absolutely do think that the solution to this is fixing the bureaucracy and the red tape, opening up the market, and fixing those supply and demand issues, and introducing transparency to pricing. Once you can do that, you'll get into a better place.
Yes. Now, I do think we should also address, health in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I should also ask you, out of curiosity, should the state have the authority to lock down the country like many governments around the world did during COVID, though many of them were also pressured to follow suit by their fellow governments? And if you believe that they do, I'm curious, what metric do you use to determine when the government would have the right to do so?
Man, that is a great question. Very, very difficult to answer. I mean, I'd say this, like, let's say that COVID, and this goes back to the gray area thing that I don't have a silver bullet answer for you on. I mean, let's say COVID was like what we thought it was. Let's say it was like what we all thought it was the week it started breaking out, and it was very viral and very deadly. There is a role that the government should play in promoting public health. I think that there's a better way to do that. I think there's a more decentralized way to do that. I don't have the answer to that question because I don't know what's the next century going to throw at us. I really don't. I mean, like, what if we have a virus that's far, far worse? I will say that the COVID lockdowns were like the biggest wealth transfer from small businesses to multinational corporations in the history of this country. All these small businesses were shut down while these multinational corporations were allowed to stay open. That was horrific. In many cases, these shutdowns were proved not to slow the spread. There have been studies that came out that showed that they were ineffective at slowing the spread. These forced lockdowns and these crazy hours where you could go and get food, they were just very bad for our kids. I have 2 toddlers. Thankfully, I had them after the pandemic. My son was born a couple years ago, right after the economy reopened. But I mean, the psychological impact of school from home, being cut off from your community. We're social animals. That is going to reverberate through this generation, through Gen Alpha and Gen Z, really for the rest of their lives. There was a study about how it literally affected the biology of their brains in a long-term way. So I think it was very, very bad. I think that you could make a case that it did more harm than good. It's easy to look back and do armchair quarterbacking because we did not know, right? I mean, you remember the fear, I'm sure, around this time. It was no one knew how bad this was. So my instinct is to say that the federal government probably shouldn't have the ability to lock down the entire country like they did. I think it was a terrible mistake. Like it caused a lot of unintended harm. But man, what if we had a virus that went around at 50% death rate? I really don't know. I don't know where you draw that line. And I am also scared in the same way that you are, is if you open that door, like what we did, the door is already open, right? The government has done it. They could do it again. As to what harms could come from that in the future. So I don't have a silver bullet answer for you on that one. But, I started a nonprofit 4 years ago that was working to pass legislation in the state of Tennessee that was going to restrict the governor's ability to do that because I felt so strongly that it was a mistake. I mean, Tennessee was one of the states that opened before many of the other states. I remember going to Detroit in, I want to say it was the spring of 2021. I'd been eating at restaurants and going out in Tennessee, and I went there and they were still on lockdown a year and a half later. And I remember talking to people about it was just despair. It was a really bad time. So I don't know, man. I don't have a clear answer. I don't have a silver bullet solution for that one.
Right. I see what you're saying. I personally believe that even if we leave the door open, if we give the government that kind of authority, I do think that is just asking for problems. And if we were to say, for example, if we take COVID, a virus with a 99% survival rate, if we switch that around, said it had a 99% fatality rate, part of me wonders in that case, if the disease was that serious, what even the point would be of locking down the country at that point? You'd think it would be pretty much a hopeless case, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, at that point, you would probably want it to be more dystopian, and people would have to be forced to be in their homes so that they couldn't transmit hard stop. I really don't know, man. This goes back to the thing that I think really does draw the line between kind of libertarians and liberals, though, is like, really when you're playing with reality, it's very, very, there are so many things that are difficult to foresee, and there's all these unintended consequences, and it cuts both ways, right? We talked about healthcare. These rules like this income tax carve out, this healthcare income tax carve out, that was not intended when they set up the income tax, and it had this consequence that affected throughout society. So I think liberals try to look at the system and they go, how can we create a system where the incentives are aligned and we're directionally moving in a way that has the least amount of harm for the most people? Whereas I think libertarians' approach to say, oh, writ large, bad, it violates the policy, it violates this one principle, we must now throw everything out. I think that can be as destructive as the alternative instinct, right? And I think there has to be some middle ground. When it comes to this situation with COVID, I could not agree more. It was a mistake. What I can say is I hope as a society, we learned from what happened. And you and I are going to go out into our lives. We're not going to forget what happened. We're going to vote, or I don't. You're an ANCAP, so you may not vote.
Right. That's
You're going to participate. You're going to raise your kids, or maybe you'll have kids if you don't have kids already, and like that will we'll remember that, and hopefully we won't make those same mistakes again. That's my hope.
right. Yes. So in that case, just to really wrap up this conversation, my last question for you at this time is basically, I know that you've spoken about your own alignment politically. How do you believe that the Republican Party has moved further to the right? And how do you also respond to the common criticism in recent years that the Democratic Party has moved further to the left?
Yeah.
And we've often heard people saying, why I left the left has become something of a cliche as a slogan. So I'm curious what you attribute this to.
So I do think the Republican Party has moved to the right, like in a real significant way. We talked about a lot of the ways they've moved to the right on this call. I mean, the mass deportations is a great example of this. Is absolutely crazy, unhinged policy. This kind of authoritarian urge to enact strongman, this overturning elections. I mean, Trump's literally come out and called for military tribunals for his political enemies. I mean, that sounds like craziness, but it's legitimately the words that he's called out for. Everyone on the right says Trump's this anti-war president, but I mean, like, Trump didn't end any wars. He killed a bunch of people in drone strikes overseas. He set records, as we talked about earlier, for drone strikes. This idea of expanding qualified immunity to all police officers, the civil asset forfeiture, the unabashed back the blue, this idea of ultimate presidential immunity. I mean, these are really far right kind of authoritarian ideas. I don't like the left-right paradigm. I put out this meme the other day that went super viral around how the Republican Party's moved to the right and the Democratic Party's kind of stayed moderate. And then I don't like the left-right paradigm because I look at things similar to like what you might look at with like the Nolan chart. I look at it as really a fight between liberalism and authoritarianism, and there are people on the left and the right that have different views, but really that's the major axis. But it didn't work for the meme, so that's what we did. But I do think the Republican Party has moved more authoritarian, and so I'll say that they have absolutely moved more authoritarian and to the right. I will say that I actually agreed with you about the Democratic Party moving to the left up until about 2021, 2022. I was actually activated. I'm scared to even admit this on a podcast, but like I was consuming a lot of the stuff that Jordan Peterson was putting out in the late 2010s around this kind of woke identity politics stuff. I saw the threat of that. I think identity politics, the collectivism on the left, this idea of oppressor versus oppressed narratives and class warfare. I saw this as very dangerous stuff. But the one thing I've seen in the last 4 years is the Democratic Party had a choice. They had a choice in 2020 when they nominated Joe Biden. They had a choice to go lean into Bernie Sanders style progressive authoritarianism or lean into a more moderate, milquetoast, middle of the road agenda. They made that choice with Biden. I was very scared. And by the way, the problem Biden had was he also had this problem where he was like trying to throw meat to his base all the time. Like he was doing a lot of this identity politics stuff. Right. Like I'm sure, like that's. I'm not saying
a lot of pandering.
Yeah, a lot of pandering. He absolutely did it too. But the like after the DNC and after Kamala's taken over, she's basically just like done a 180. Like I thought she was going to go more progressive. She's done a 180. And this is, again, you could look at her convention speech and really get a lot of that. She did not mention, I don't even think she mentioned LGBTQ rights like one time. That's not a good thing, in my opinion, by the way. I'm like a big advocate for, equal treatment for the LGBT community and whatnot. But I guess where I'm going with this is this positioning to kind of feed red meat to that base. And there's some words that resonate with them. This shift is not playing out the way I anticipated it. And I think the Kamala Harris is absolutely pivoting to the center, both in her rhetoric and in like her policy agenda. She's not going as full economically populist as we talked about earlier. So I think the Democratic Party probably went a little bit to the left, but I think they're in the process of moving back. Whereas the Republican Party just seems to be going way deeper into the fringe. That's my read on it. I hope, this is at the center of what I'm trying to do, I hope we can build a coalition in the Democratic Party, or at least people that might be swing voters that might be willing to vote for a moderate Democrat, and build that out so that politicians like Kamala Harris don't have an incentive to lean into the worst urges of the far left, but instead have a voter base of people that understand liberalism and understand economics and are willing to reward her when she moves into the right direction rather than just being fully co-opted by the far left. So I think that would be a good thing for society if we can pull that off. And I've been more encouraged by the last couple of years than I anticipated being, because it got really pretty bad in the 2010s. Pretty bad on the left.
In regards to Donald Trump and the right, I'm surprised that he and Obama don't get along so well. You'd think they could bond over their own combined drone strikes.
I say that was one thing. The one thing that I give Obama credit for, though, is at least he had some transparency. Like, he had introduced rules when he was president to like report on his activity. All that was repealed by Trump. And I don't know if they'll bond too much, because at least Obama like has a broad commitment to democracy, whereas Trump doesn't. But yeah, that's what I say. We go back to the foreign policies of the 2010s and the 2000s. That shit gets terribly messy. I'm glad we're out of that period. Very glad.
Right. Yes. If I may just ask one final question, out of sheer curiosity, this very last question, what is your prediction for the future of the classical liberal movement in the United States?
I think that we have the greatest opportunity as classical liberals right now to lead an intellectual movement and a return to liberalism, to recontextualize liberalism for the modern time, to eradicate and erase a lot of the falsehoods that kind of were put on our ideology in the 20th century. An unprecedented opportunity in this political moment to bring America back to these ideas. So I am incredibly hopeful. I also say liberalism always wins in the end, because the sheer power of giving people freedom in their own lives, it will always beat authoritarianism. So even if we drift back into authoritarianism for a period, and we may have dark times like we did in the 20th century, I hope not. I know that our ideology will win, but I'm incredibly confident or excited about this moment, because as this political realignment plays out, the people that have our political views have a great opportunity, unlike what we've seen since the 70s and the 80s, to lead an intellectual return to this. And so I'm pretty hopeful about it. Maybe that's a cope, but that's what I'm going with.
Well, I, for one, am certainly curious to see how that prediction plays out. But in that case, until then, thank you, Josh, for appearing on the show, and I want to thank everybody out there for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow Joshua Reed Eakle and take a look into Project Liberal. Subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.